The movie begins with the police searching a forest in Tochigi Prefecture, Japan, seeming to be looking for something or someone. They come across a bonfire that seems to have been lit a few days back, and an old camera on the ground in the forest. A female police officer continues the search and arrives at an old, creepy house. She opens the door to discover wooden statues inside and looks up to find some dripping red contents on a book with the title, Folktale, written on it. Immediately she screams. The author then begins to tell a story about 6 children who went missing in 1968, Showa 43. In a place that looks like a hospital, Professor Ryo and an interpreter named Kazunori Itoku come to talk to a man in a wheelchair with bandages over his face and covered in transparent polythene. They start by asking him what his name is, and without getting a reply, they ask if he understands what they're saying. He answers positively. Kazunori then tells Professor Ryo that he seems to be an American. The man asks where he is, and they tell him that he's safe and is in a facility that seems like a hospital. They then ask him if he knows what happened to him, and he answers no. They tell him that their presence there is to find out who he is. They play a tape on a laptop, and a girl named Kate is shown making a video using a camera, seemingly talking to someone through the recording. She says she got the new camera and it's ready to go to Japan. She continues that her boyfriend is flying in from San Francisco and wishes he was on her flight, but it is okay because she needs to sleep on the plane. She gets worried as she doesn't know how Chris is going to react to traveling, mentioning they've been childhood friends since kindergarten. Aside from the fact he speaks some Japanese, she adds that he needs the trip as good luck, because he had a breakdown earlier this year from the demise of his brother in a horrific accident. She explains her reason for going to Japan, which is to do a thesis on religious studies, specifically how religion changes myth and vice versa, while also wanting to photograph obscure Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples in rural Japan. The video is paused, and the professor asks the man if he recognizes her. He, in return, inquires where they found the video, but the professor demands again, "What's her name?" A flashback begins, taking us 5 days earlier to Tokyo, where Kate is in a cab with Chris. She's talking to her boyfriend James, telling him they'll arrive in 10 minutes. She drops the call with an "I love you" at the end, and starts a conversation with Chris, reminding him they haven't seen each other in a long time, and she's glad to see him. Chris replies that he is too. They arrive at a hotel to see Kate's boyfriend waiting for her at the entrance. He welcomes her with a kiss and extends a handshake to Chris. He takes them to their rooms, and they all set out to sightsee in the streets of Japan. Chris uses the camera to capture their moments, taking pictures and videos of their touring, focusing mainly on Kate. James notices this and talks to her about it back at the hotel. Kate tells him she doesn't like Chris and asks if he's jealous. When he asks a question about how long they've been friends, he replies he's not jealous, and Kate kisses him. The next day, they pack their bags and get on a train to go on a trip. On the train, James engages Chris, asking him how he learned Japanese and how long he and Kate have been friends. Chris replies that he learned because he's always wanted to come here, but fails to answer the second question as Kate removes her earpiece and asks what they're talking about. Chris says they're talking about her. The scene shifts back to Professor Ryo and Kazunori with the injured man, suggesting it might be Kate's boyfriend or Chris telling the story. The camera veers back to the flashback as they arrive in a Japanese quarter. Kate is making video memories with Chris when he says he feels like a third wheel. Kate tells him it's just for one night. He nods in response and continues unpacking. They go out on tour again and walk into an old store that sells Japanese artifacts. They try on different artifacts, and Kate finds the Folktale book. She picks it up and opens it to find a picture of a beautiful temple. She calls out to Chris and asks if he can read what's written on it. Chris replies that it looks like a journal and mentions a trickster, a shapeshifter, half woman and half fox. Kate inquires if they will be able to locate the place, and he affirms that they will. They go to the counter to buy the book, and the storekeeper looks through it in shock, immediately asking them where they found the book. Chris says they found it on the shelf, and she tells them the book is not a good pick and is not for sale. Kate, displeased, tells Chris to ask her how much she wants for it. Before Chris speaks, she tells them to leave and that she's closing her shop. Wondering what happened, Kate asks what they did wrong, and Chris says he doesn't know. Her boyfriend James convinces them to leave, and they do. Late at night, James suggests they go to a club, but Kate says she has jet lag. He leaves with Chris, and at the club, James dances with a random Asian woman. Chris catches a glimpse of this and makes a video of it. Back to Professor Ryo and Kazunori. They ask the man if he knows who that is, saying it's a good question to ask. The focus then shifts to Chris, now outside the club, who goes back to the store they were at earlier and sees the Folktale book. He picks it up, smiling, thinking Kate would love it. A boy then comes up from behind and asks how he can help him. Chris gets jump scared and looks back with a smile, asking the boy if he works there. The boy says he does. Chris asks if there are any adults around, and the boy says he's one, telling him that he's almost 9. Chris agrees. He then tells the boy he'd like to buy the book. Later, we see him leaving the store with it. He goes to a pub to drink and meets a man who tells him the temple is very unlucky and will make him sick. He warns him not to go there, saying there are many other temples in Japan. Chris ignores the warning and asks the pub owner where he can find the temple, learning it's above the owner's village up on the mountain. He leaves the pub and tries to buy a drink outside when his coins fall from his pocket. As he bends to pick it up, a woman who seems like a beggar appears from the side and bends to pick his coin too. As he sees her head with marks of horns on it, he runs away in fear and is stopped by a group of men passing with basket masks on their heads. After this, he goes back to the lodge and drops the book on the shelf where Kate is sleeping. A monster's hand then descends from above to grasp the book, triggering a series of visions. Chris wakes up in the morning, realizing it was all a dream. As he opens his eyes, Kate sits opposite him and smiles as she reads the book he brought for her. She asks him how he got it, and he tells her it's a long story. He conveys to her he can find the temple. She smiles, and they start their journey. They arrive at a village and go in to see a man who ignores them and starts running from them. They walk higher a bit and greet a woman who in turn answers them. They inquire if there is an inn nearby where they can lodge. The woman looks around to see if anyone is watching and points to a restaurant at the top of the hill, telling them they might find a room there. An old man calls them and asks why they're in his village. Chris tells him they've come to see the temple, and the man says they can go themselves, calling the temple Hitoshi. He recounts the story of a boy named Hitoshi, who was named after the temple. As a child, Hitoshi visited the temple, where he experienced various visions. Later, he descended from the mountain holding his eyes in his hands. Kate asks him what he means by this, but Chris says he doesn't know and thanks the man, starting to leave, while the others follow. They arrive at the restaurant, and James knocks on the door. An old woman comes out, and they ask her if she has a room available. She says she does and asks them to come in. Chris then comes upon an open door and sees a blind man who's completely without his eyes. The man looks in his direction, and Chris scarily runs off. Late at night, Kate and her boyfriend James tell Chris they're going for a walk, and she asks him what he thinks of the place. He says it's great. Alone in the lodge, the old woman comes with a blanket to give Chris and invites him out for a drink, saying it's usually cold at night. Drinking together, Chris asks her to tell him about the temple. She replies there's nothing to tell, aside from the fact that after the quarry closed, no one visits the temple anymore, and she was 17 at the time. She tells him she needs to lay their beds and leaves the room. Chris begins to take pictures of the room when he sees the boy who sold the folktale book to him. He asks what he's doing there, and the boy replies to him that it's his house, and he's been going to the village since he was a kid. He then offers Chris he can take him there if he wants, and Chris says yes. The grandma then interrupts, mentioning it's time for bed. On his way to sleep, Chris meets Hitoshi outside and goes up to him to ask what happened to his eyes and inquire about the story of the temple. Hitoshi begins by saying that some years back, some children disappeared from the area, and the police traced it to the temple and met a man there, a wandering monk. They question him about the missing children, but do not believe the answers he gives and butcher him. The children are never found, and Hitoshi says every year, they burn candles and pray the children will return. Later that night, Kate and James, now back, are being intimate. Chris begins to film this from his room when he notices a man walk up and slightly open the door of his room to look in. When the man finds Chris is not asleep, he runs away. Chris stands to try and see who it is, but wakes everyone else in the process. An angry James then asks him if he's enjoying the show, seeing as he wasn't asleep. Chris apologizes, and they all go back to bed. Early in the morning, the boy takes them on the way to the temple. They go into the forest to try to locate the temple, and a voiceover, possibly the man in the polythene, begins to say he could feel it as they got closer, that the temple knew they were coming. Professor Rio then asks who helped them find the temple, and the man says the boy, Seda. They finally arrive somewhere, and Seda hides behind a tree. Kate goes to take a picture. Chris looks strangely at the statue in front of a small hut, and Seda tells them to pray, bowing his head to the statue. Chris follows. After a while, James goes into a cave to take a leak. The others notice he's gone for a while and go to find him. They find him, and he tells them to follow him so he can show them something. They enter the cave, and James exclaims that it's an old mine that he believes will go on for miles. He asks who will go in with him. Kate disagrees, saying she wants to find the temple first. James disagrees again, trying to make her understand that they might not be able to find it if they go to the temple first. Kate suggests leaving a mark so they can find their way back to it. They leave Kate's scarf behind as a hint of their way back. After walking for a while, they find the statue in the book and happily move close to it, saying they must be close to the temple. Kate looks at the statue and asks Chris what it's called. He says it's a trickster, a shapeshifter that protects the temple. They continue to move, but Seda stays for a while, staring at the statue before following them. They reach the temple, and James and Kate go inside, but Chris stays behind as he notices Seda standing behind a tree. Seeming he found something, Chris approaches him and asks what he found. He picks a handbell from the ground and rings it twice. Seda says it's getting late, and his mother will soon start to wonder where he is. Chris questions if he can find his way back, and Seda nods, telling Chris to remember he must be back before it gets dark. Chris agrees and goes into the temple after watching him leave. They begin their exploration. Kate takes pictures of the stone graves outside the temple, and Chris makes videos of the statues inside. James complains that it's getting dark, and he doesn't want to descend the mountain in the dark, so they should leave. Kate utters that they have torches to guide them back and tells him to chill, sending him away with an "I love you." Kate then hears a rustle in the bushes ahead of her. She looks back, thinking it is James, and calls out his name but finds no one there. Chris also hears the same sound inside the temple while recording, and looks back. Outside, James reappears, and Kate breaks the news to him of thinking she saw something, but tells him not to worry, saying it's getting dark and they should leave. James tries to say something, and she insists that they should go find Chris and leave. Immediately after, she starts to go into the temple and calls out to Chris. As he answers, a hand suddenly comes from beneath the surface to drag him into an underground tunnel. Kate and James hear this and run into the temple. Reaching the temple, they see a hole, and James jumps in to wake Chris, who seems to have fainted. As he wakes up, Kate then calms down and asks what they're going to do. Chris immediately says that someone pulled him through the floor. James then calms him down and says it's going to be fine. He suggests they make themselves comfortable and go down in the morning to ask for help. Kate disagrees and says she's not staying there. James then demands her to speak up if she has a better idea, and she can come up with nothing. Late into the night, after they've pulled Chris out, they gather outside the temple and light a bonfire. James then suggests they take a walk, but the others decline, saying they'd rather stay back. James reluctantly leaves, and Kate engages Chris by asking if he likes James. Chris replies that he's not what he expected, and asks what her parents think. She says that her mum is indecisive, and her father keeps trying to set her up with a golf pro player. Taking a bold step, she declares that she hasn't told James about the baby, and Chris is the only one who knows. She'll tell him when they get down from the mountain. Immediately after saying this, Chris shines a torch on her, and asks what she wants to tell him. She says she isn't talking about him, only for him to get angry and go into the temple. Kate follows him, and they argue until James comes out with his bags, angry. He informs Chris that there's water and food to sustain them until morning, while also mentioning his intention to summon help from the village in the morning, and then depart. Devastated, Kate says they'll need more firewood and goes away too. On his way back, James tells the trickster, protector of the temple, to go fuck herself. Kate, in the woods finding wood to burn, has an issue with her torch and starts crying as she hits it to work. Immediately after, 3 figures suddenly appear in front of her. James, on the other hand, now seems lost. Kate comes back with tears in her eyes, saying that the torch burned out and that the place doesn't feel right. They go in to lie down and sleep as she takes her jacket off and covers them both with it, cuddling each other. I can feel sparks, guys. Can you too? A few minutes later, Chris hears a creaking sound and looks back, but we're immediately taken to James, who's still in the forest trying to find his way, seemingly going in circles as he comes to find the statue of the trickster again. He stares in disbelief for a second, and the next moment he notices that the statue is no longer there. He shines his torch around and finds the shape-shifting monster behind him. Scared for his life, he begins to slowly walk back. Immediately, Kate opens her eyes as she hears a sound from a distance. She then calls out to James and says that he needs her. Chris, who can't seem to walk, tries to stop her but to no avail. She storms out to find the love of her life. James tries to follow her, standing up to limp toward the door only to fall down the stairs. The monster begins to pursue James through the forest until he falls down a hill and lies on the floor. Chris now notices a strange figure sitting in front of the bonfire before he stands and starts to approach him. He reacts immediately and crawls back into the temple to lock the door. Kate sees a torch shining at a distance and follows it while shouting James's name. The monster, who is now caught up with James, places its hands on his body as James shakes in fear of being devoured. Kate again hears the sound of people crying and follows it into the cave James had found earlier. She goes deep into the cave shouting, thinking someone would answer. Chris, who is now in the temple, notices that the hand that earlier dragged him seemed like a person's hand coming out of the hole he fell into. Scared, he opens his eyes wide and sticks himself to the door of the temple tightly. He sees 6 kids come out of the ground with their eyes completely. On the other end of the spectrum, Kate, who is now very deep into the cave, continues to shout hello as she moves and hears crying sounds, not knowing that a monster is right behind her. Furthermore, Chris is being attacked by the children in the temple, who seem to have grown monster teeth, and they start to devour him. Back to Kate, she walks a little more and sees James on his knees at a distance and runs to him. Reaching him, she finds his eyes missing and blood all over him. She runs back and falls immediately upon seeing this, then stands and starts running her way out of the cave, shouting for help. She gets tired after running for a while and walks while crying. She comes to a blind alley and shouts that there's no way out, falling to her knees and crying. Chris is now screaming and crying inside the temple. Kate continues to cry on the ground. The scene shifts back to the present day with Professor Rio and Kazunori with the Polythene Man. They tell him that the reason he's here is that they're trying to find a Miss Thomas, Kate, and they need him to tell them what happened to her, calling him Christopher. Our Polythene Man is Chris, guys. I'm sure a lot of us must have known this when James lost his eyes earlier on. Chris then asks why Seda is there at the hospital with them. The professor asks who Seda is, and Chris says he's the boy from the village who took them to the temple, and says he's in the hallway. They tell him that there's no boy, and ask what happened to Kate instead. Chris begins to remember all the places he's met the boy, and the boy suddenly starts disappearing from his memories. Professor Rio asks where Kate is again, saying that they know he assassinated James, and there's video evidence that seemingly backs it up. Chris doesn't reply until Professor Rio gets a call from someone and says he won't tell them anything. Chris spots Seda with his eyes blind and pitch black like the blind kids in the temple. Immediately in the room where Chris is, he reacts, stands up, stabs Kazunori in the neck, and runs off. The scene shifts to the restaurant around the temple where they slept and shows the grandma lighting a candle and staring at a picture of 11 kids, including Seda, in the frame. However, Kate is shown stuck in the temple alive and breathing. Pretty weird way to end a movie if you ask me. Will there be a second part though? Stay tuned.